In PSO2, the Hunter, Fighter, Braver, and Bouncer classes all have toggleable stances. These very stances come in the form of a skill on said class's skill trees. By default, every stance on the left side of the tree is always on whether you spec into it or not. The stance to the right on every tree will then become a skill you can place on your sub-palette once learned. And when used, it will light up with an animation to show you that it's now active. And before we go any further, I know many are curious about this, and the answer is yes. You can use stances from your main and subclass at the same time, and they are multiplicative to each other like all things in the skill trees are. Now, I do talk about each class's stances in their respective class videos, but let's go over them again briefly because on some classes you might want to use both stances, and on some you might not, and when using certain classes as a main versus sub, your choice of stances will also sometimes be different too. Starting with Hunter, you have Fury Stance and Guard Stance. Fury simply gives a ton of unconditional damage and some crit rate if you want. Guard Stance mitigates damage but can also get a strong damage buff that puts it on par with Fury Stance when perfect blocking often. As a Hunter, you generally only want to pick one stance and use the rest of your points into quality of life or survivability skills, especially with the limited points we have right now. Though, when using Hunter as a sub, it is only suggested to use Fury Stance, and this is because Guard Stance's damage buff only works as a main class, and again, Fury is completely unconditional, which is truly amazing. Next up is Fighter, and their stances are Valiant Stance and Wise Stance, and these are super straightforward. With both stances, you can get a damage bonus when hitting any side of the enemy. But with Valiant, you will deal more damage to the front, and with Wise, you will deal more damage to the back. And when using Fighter as a main, it's best to only use one stance per build, and it's usually Valiant, and there's a few reasons for this. First off, yet again, there's limited skill points, and you could use those points elsewhere. And this actually doesn't really even change with the extra skill points we get in the future either. Next is the fact that most enemies will actually be facing you, and some bosses you will almost never be able to get behind at all either. Though once you get pretty comfortable with this class, you might want to make another tree with Wise Stance instead for specific bosses. However, when it comes to using Fighter as a sub, this is where you can take both stances and swap between the two as needed, as you will have a lot more skill points to use that would normally be used on main class only skills. Moving on to Braver, there is Basic Stance and Precision Stance. Basic Stance is very similar to Hunter's Fury Stance as it gives straight unconditional damage modifiers. Then Precision Stance offers a little bit more damage than Basic Stance, though you must either be hitting a weak spot or have your weapon's element match the enemy's elemental weakness. Due to how easy it is to sometimes hit weak spots on bosses, it is highly suggested to always take both stances no matter which way you build Braver whatsoever. If you had to pick only one stance, I'd take Basic Stance, but you really should be taking both. As far as using Braver as a sub, I would not suggest it, especially to newer players, but if you were to, still use both stances. Lastly, there's Bouncer stances, Elemental Stance and Break Stance. Elemental Stance gives a bonus to your damage when matching your weapons or tech's element to the enemy's elemental weaknesses, and gives a much smaller bonus when not matching it up. This stance is really only used for jet boots nowadays, as the boots can change their element on the fly by charging any non-support tech of that element. Then, with Break Stance, you get a bonus when attacking a breakable part, and when using Soaring Blades with Break Stance D bonus in your tree for only 1 point, you can still get 90% of that bonus even when not hitting a breakable part. So, with that said, each of these stances are more geared towards each of Bouncer's weapons. Though jet boots can make use of Break Stance, whereas Soaring Blades don't really ever need to use Elemental Stance anymore. I will however still always suggest using both weapons on Bouncer as they make up for each other's shortcomings. And you have enough skill points to take both stances too, and just dance between the two as needed. In this class too, I cannot suggest as a sub at all as its damage is highly conditional, and only its class's weapons can really make use of these conditions. Before I let you guys go, I'll give you one more example in case you still don't get the stance swapping part. So on my Hunter Fighter, in this build I am spec'd into Guard Stance on Hunter and have both stances on my Fighter sub. So this means I have to have Guard Stance on my sub palette hotbar to use to toggle on Guard Stance at the beginning of every quest, because Fury is on by default. I will then also need to put Wise Stance on my bar because Valiant Stance is always on by default as well, and I might sometimes want to swap to Wise Stance. The easiest way to remember any of this is that if the stance icon is lit up with the animation on your sub palette, then that stance is on. If it's not, then the other is. I really hope this has cleared up some confusion, and with that, take care.